So, welcome to the next edition of the Rare Business Podcast. With me today, I have Cennydd Bowles, who is a designer and writer focusing on the ethics of emerging technologies. Hi, Cennydd. How are you doing?
Hi, Adrian. I'm very good, thanks.
So, Cennydd, for the benefit of our listeners and readers, can you tell us a bit about you and also a bit about the work that you do?
Sure thing. So I'm a designer by trade. I've worked in the tech industry for 15 or so years at a variety of companies. Most recently, in terms of my full-time role, I was design manager at Twitter, so heading up the team in London. Previous to that, I've worked for agencies, for government, for startups, e-commerce companies, and so on, in a variety of design and technology positions. Right now, as you mentioned, my focus is emerging technology and particularly the ethics of it. So I'm spending a lot of time thinking about that, doing some consulting, but mostly writing. And I'm working on a big writing project right now to try and help forward that cause, I suppose, within the tech industry. And I think we've reached the point now where that need is hopefully fairly obvious. So I want to try and provide some of the solutions to some of those questions for the tech industry as well.
Perfect. So now, we met a few months ago at a Wolf Ollins event, which is part of London Tech Week, which was great because I found out that you were an avid sort of football fan, as Aaron. So there's a common thread we keep kind of going through our conversations. But
Right.
Some of the things that you, apart from football aside, so this is not a football podcast, but we could make it a football podcast, but that's possibly for another episode.
I think so.
But you were talking at that event about ethics in tech, as you've alluded to just before. Now, it's something I've been questioning too over the last sort of year or so. And I've written some things about whether things like behavioral design, behavioral economics, and being customer-centric were actually compatible. And that's kind of my kind of rising question, as it were. I mean, what would be useful is if you could summarize kind of what you think are some of the big dangers that you are seeing kind of emerging, just to kind of like set the context.
Sure. I mean, it is quite a broad church because both the phrases ethics and and technology are pretty large. They contain multitudes. I think in 2017 we've seen a lot of these issues now come to the fore, particularly things like algorithmic bias. That's been featured quite heavily. You've doubtless seen Google Photos product that labeled black people gorillas.
Yeah.
Maybe ProPublica's investigation into policing, algorithms that predict crime that do so in a racist and biased manner. There's also an increasing discussion around data ethics. We're soon going to enter an era of ubiquitous facial recognition, maybe even lip reading technology. There's going to be a lot of implications for privacy for the individual and for society at large. I am particularly interested in the persuasion ethics angle as well. This is sort of, I think, one of the things I talked about at that event. We're reaching an era where technologies will know so much about the individual, they'll know the buttons that they can push, essentially. That we'll enter an era of what some people are calling hyper nudge. So taking this idea of nudge theory, but really making it almost impossible to resist. Getting to the point where technologies can manipulate you without even really you knowing that's going on. There are obviously sustainability concerns surrounding some technology, particularly cryptocurrencies at the moment. I've been studying Bitcoin for a little while, and every month the comparable energy consumption country goes up. It was Paraguay, then it became Tunisia, and now they're just getting increasingly large. So it's consuming as much energy as large nations now.
Wow. Okay.
Upgrade cycles of technologies and so on. The VW scandal was very much a software design scandal. And then, of course, there's all sorts of weird, far future interesting stuff about what are the economic impacts of technology, the end of work, automating jobs away, things like that. What does that mean for our economic and social realities in, say, 10, 20, 50 years? And the weird and wonderful sci-fi stuff, robot rights, automated weaponry, superintelligence, and so on. That clearly has an ethical component as well. So there's plenty there to keep me occupied. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I think you've picked up a really big bucket to lug around with you.
Sure have, yes.
But I mean, that's all brilliant. I mean, and one of the challenges about ethics is that it can all feel a little bit ethereal sometimes.
Yeah.
And I guess my kind of question would be, when we get down to brass tacks, is like kind of what effect is all of this sort of this ethics and new and emerging technologies, what effect is it having on, customers and employees? Because that's kind of where we're actually going to really see kind of things play out for good or for bad, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. That's where the rubber, meets the road, doesn't it? I think you're right to say ethics as an abstract concept can be seen as kind of dreary and philosophical. I sometimes joke there's this attitude, there's no dessert until you've finished your Plato. It's very much something you have to, grind your way through and dust off these ancient tomes. But you're right, it is becoming it always has been, but it's becoming a more visible consumer effect. So I think in terms of what we're seeing with customers, they are, I think, getting more savvy around ethical issues. I think a lot of that's been driven by press interest, to be honest. The press has now latched firmly onto the idea, and I think it's a correct idea, that the tech industry is heading into some very swampy ethical territory. And so that drives a lot of interest, of course. Certainly some companies within the tech industry and without, outside it as well, are becoming toxic. You're starting to see brand toxicity attaching to companies that are in frequent and flagrant ethical violation. I'm sure we can probably think of one company that starts with an U and ends with a B that's probably the most clear example of that. They're a wonderful example for me. They keep serving up these mistakes. And of course, you can trot out all sorts of tropes about how the general public is now more able to effect change, to mobilize on social issues, for instance, through things like social media, whereas previously they didn't have a huge amount of recourse. So we're seeing more public pressure being put against companies for, say, the advertising money that they take or the decisions that they make or the products that they rip off, for instance. So I think customers are able to bring the repercussions of that to companies in a more readily apparent fashion. For employees, I think there are a couple of things. I think there is certainly an increasing demand for companies to behave in an ethical way. It's a bit of a cliche to say, but I think the millennial workforce is certainly a driver of that. I think I read a recent study said that 50% of millennials would rather work doing something purposeful than to command a high salary. And that's a high figure.
Sure.
And I think also there's a growing demand within some of those more politically and ethically switched on employees to demand essentially politicization of companies. This is becoming something that's really tricky for companies to handle. I mean, look at what's happened recently with Virgin Trains and the Daily Mail. They withdrew the Daily Mail due to internal pressure. They had staff who didn't want the company to stock that newspaper on the trains, and of course it caused this whole furore about, are they suppressing free speech, and is this a politically biased decision? But companies are receiving this kind of pressure now from companies to become more actively political. Companies have tried very hard to not do that, so that's going to be a tough challenge. And I suppose there's one more thing related to the future of employment, which is, I think a lot of employees now start to have this creeping neurosis of, well, what's going to happen to my job?
Sure.
Within 5, 10, 20 years, are you actually going to want to employ people like me, or are they going to be replaced by AI and robots?
I think there's I was at an event just in the autumn, and Tom Peters was there, and he made an interesting statement where he said, look, I live in Silicon Valley, and I've been a fan of Silicon Valley for years and years. He said, but the idea that some of these tech companies are taking an amoral stance on their platforms is completely ludicrous. And he was just kind of, in his kind of way, in his Tom Peters way, was just calling them out. It was expletive laden, which made it kind of a bit more powerful. But I thought it was an interesting kind of thing, and it leads me on to this idea. Is like, but almost, do you think that there might be this kind of rise, and they're turning up the volume in companies' duty of care towards both their employees and their kind of customers? Because actually a lot of this stuff is really complicated, and not everybody kind of understands it. But actually, is it just a rising concern of, we just want people we want to do good work, or we want to buy decent things and get value and stuff, but there's some things we don't understand, and therefore we just expect, and we want people to almost take care of us?
Perhaps. I mean, Do you know what I mean? Somewhat, yes. I think the language you're using there reflects what's sometimes applied to nudge theory and persuasion design,
Right.
behavioral design. There's this idea of libertarian paternalism, which they use. That there is something interesting about how companies and how societies and organizations and so on can effect change that may be for the benefit of individuals, even if the individual themselves doesn't realize that's what they want, yes or no. I mean, you do get into tricky questions about, is that actually right, that we should decide what is in someone else's best interest?
Yeah.
Who are we to determine that? Surely they are the right people to do it. And it's one of the things that worries me about the ethical discussion if we get it wrong, is that actually we end up trying to take those choices and say, well, don't worry, we've got this. We know what society needs. You know what Silicon Valley's like. We tend to believe we know what's in everyone's best interest. We tend to know the right solution, we think, to every problem.
Yeah.
And that we actually exclude people from that process. We become technocrats rather than democrats. And there is a concern there. I think to do ethics right, we shouldn't be just saying, don't worry, we've got this, we know what's in your interest. We should be engaging people in the design process,
right,
in the product development process, and say, well, what do you need from this? How can we serve your needs better? So, I think there is a risk that we go a bit too far with that. But for me, it's a question of changing our process and changing the way we engage with the people we serve and the people we affect in society.
So I know that you're sort of you're wrestling all of this to the ground. When you talked about this, you're writing a book related to all of this called Future Ethics, and that's due out later this year. I mean, can you tell me a little bit more about the book and its progress when it's due out? Because it feels like with all of this stuff going on, then it's going to be much needed.
Well, that's my hope for sure. In an ideal world, it would probably be useful today, but it's not finished yet.
Right.
So it's in progress. I'm sure some of your listeners have written a book themselves. They will know that it's not one of the easier things you can choose to do in life. It's a test. So I'm struggling along with it, but I think it's coming on well. The book is aimed specifically at people working in technology.
Right.
So be they product managers or entrepreneurs or designers. I obviously, as I say, have a design background myself. But for people inside the industry who are starting to become concerned by some of these issues and want an idea of, well, what can we do? How can we try and tackle these? But what I'm trying to avoid writing is like a handbook to ethics. I don't think such a thing is sensible. I don't think it can really exist because it's much more about understanding problems.
Right.
It is applying some pat answers and some templated responses. That doesn't work for ethics. So I'm trying to get people to engage with the ethical complexities of their work, give them some tools, drawing back on ancient ethics and contemporary ethics, and say, well, here's what people might, philosophers might say, you should try this, or something more applied, something more practical. Well, here is a technique that another company has used. Maybe this is worth talking about with your company. But it's not a book for people who want straight answers of, how do I deploy X, Y, and Z ethical systems. As I say, I think that's a waste of time.
Right.
But it's the concerned and engaged technologists to try and bring ethical change into their own companies, I suppose.
Okay, perfect. So, kind of with all that in mind, and you talked about kind of like this idea about providing advice or kind of tools to help people think through kind of what the right thing to do. I mean, I guess that's my next question is like, so what is an entrepreneur, or what is a product manager or a leader or a senior exec to do, and how should they start wrestling with these things? I mean, it's not just a binary thing, right? It's not a case of like, oh, that's fearful, therefore I'm going to shut it all off. It's not about choosing not to use any of the tools and techniques. Yes. But I guess it's kind of, it's, I mean, one, that doesn't mean to say that you shouldn't choose not to use them, because that's a choice open to you. But what would you how do you think businesses should be managing or wrestling with these concerns?
I mean, I think you sort of hit on a very relevant point there, which is that it's not about just relinquishing all this technology and say, you know what, we're not going to use AI, we're not going to use algorithms or, whatever it is. It's sometimes easy for the tech ethics debate to sound a bit Ludditist, a bit defeatist, and to say, no, actually, we need to just step off this train altogether. Clearly, that's not going to happen. Clearly, there are significant benefits that these technologies can bring to the world. And so I don't want ethics to be seen as something that should oppose them. It should just accompany them and try and steer them in the right direction. For me, probably the largest step that companies can take and leaders can take is to broaden their perspective on who a stakeholder is. It's
Right.
not just their internal stakeholders, it's not just their direct customers, but it's also people who are affected by the technologies or the products that they develop. So, for instance, if you're, say, working on something, let's say you're working on Facebook newsfeed, you may think of your primary constituents as publishers, as users of Facebook. I think we've now started to realize that you also have to consider the needs of democracy,
Yes.
of citizens, etc. So it's broadening our perspectives and saying, well, who are the people we previously not really thought would be impacted by this? How can we identify any potential consequences for these people that we didn't plan for, these unintended consequences, and how can we try and mitigate those?
Sure.
So it's about broadening that perspective. It's about training individuals and teams and setting up your processes to have that slightly broader perspective, and then really trying to drill down on what could happen. And you still won't get it right, of course. You're never going to anticipate every unintended consequence, but it will better arm you for seeing danger around the corner, I suppose, and being able to hopefully respond to that in an agile way so that you make fewer mistakes.
I guess that reminds me of that old saying which says, plans are useless, but the act of planning is invaluable.
Yes, it's precisely that. You set yourself up to better respond to that kind of risk, and even if you see it coming, you're more alert to it and able to adapt to it.
Sure.
I think another thing that's important actually is that the people who are excellent at this are people from the humanities. That's design researchers, sociologists, even philosophers. These are folks who've understood the social impact of all sorts of inventions and technologies and changes. And the tech industry has generally not hired too many of these people. They've mostly gone for STEMish, comp sci, undergrads, graduates, things like that. I think there's now an increasing realization that actually, some of these people from the ologies can be terrifically useful for these companies. So I am seeing more folks like that getting hired within Silicon Valley, and that's a trend I hope continues.
It's interesting you mentioned sort of STEM subjects, so, science, technology, engineering, mathematics and things, and that's been the big focus on both government and education kind of policy in terms of building up our musculature on in those sort of areas, and that's kind of what kind of companies are looking for. But I saw this really interesting sort of title or headline for this event that's was running in Scotland, which says, forget about STEM, let's see more STEAM.
Right.
And the A standing for more arts.
Sure. I mean, there's not a huge amount left outside of that category, really.
Yeah. No, exactly. But I think it just alludes to that, like you're saying, that sort of more rounded kind of liberal sort of education, and how that's kind of been eliminated from the narrative, or for some narratives, kind of like for a while. But actually, it's interesting seeing it come back in. And I remember talking to a company called Jamf, who are an Apple ecosystem sort of like support company for like businesses that are working on an Apple platform. And they said that actually the largest number of their people that they hire and the people that are most successful at their company come from a liberal arts background. And the reason being is that they said they have this capacity because they've learned how to learn in many ways. So they've learned how to put the hat on from other kind of people and learn from different people's perspectives. And that idea of this empathetic perspective is something they've found hugely valuable. But because they've also got this trained and developed sort of skill in terms of learning how to learn, and as long as they've got an interest in it, it's quite easy to upskill them in some of the more technical disciplines. So I thought that was kind of actually a really, really interesting kind of perspective, and we're starting to see signs of some of that sort of stuff kind of happening more and more. But I think you're absolutely right, is that that sort of skill base and those sort of people, I think we're going to see the demand for those sort of people kind of bubbling up kind of more and more as people kind of wrestle this problem to the ground.
Yeah, I think they become good partners
Yes.
for the more STEMish folks. And don't get me wrong, I still think companies will need science, technology, engineering, and maths folks. My background is physics, actually, so I've seen this sort of from both perspectives. But when you have a team that combines the more maybe procedurally driven thinking and the perhaps more rigorous thinking of people from science backgrounds with the broader holistic perspectives of the osophies and the ologies, that team could be unstoppable. I think that's a great partnership, and I'm keen for the tech industry to rediscover that more polymathic approach.
Perfect. So, if I was to ask you to kind of like to bring this to sort of to light in many ways, and to think about maybe other companies out there that you think that you're seeing that are ahead of the curve on this sort of thing, they're getting it right or making the right moves. I mean, could you give me a couple of examples of people that you think are leading the way, and what do you think that they're doing right, or what's putting them on the right path?
I can think of companies that are doing good things in sort of local maxima, if you like.
Right.
I would highlight, for instance, Apple on privacy.
Right.
I think they're very focused on data ethics. They're spending a lot of time trying to recruit people working on machine learning systems who want to work in Apple's way. They want to have more computation on the device. They want less going to the cloud. They want to maintain privacy through things like differential privacy. And they're making, strong noises about that. Now, the counter to that is that so happens to benefit Apple's business model, which is selling devices with differentiated software and hardware. There's a guy called Ben Thompson from Stratechery talks about this a lot. So that just happens to benefit them. So, I mean, this privacy thing for them is also, it's not a huge sacrifice for them to push this angle. So they're doing great on the privacy thing. I would say a company like, I don't know, Lush, I mean, they're not a tech company really, but they are responding very well, for instance, to the political aspect of their work. They're a nakedly political company. They stand for certain things and they oppose certain things. And they've said, well, you know what? There are some customers that won't be happy with those choices, and we're fine with that. And so that's a brave stance for a company to take. I think we're going to have to see more of that in future. Polarization, external and internal within companies is going to grow. Uber, I've said, obviously have been this almost a poster child for unethical behavior in the past. I think over the last few months they are trying to turn it around, and I think Dara Khosrowshahi is the new CEO, isn't he? And what I've seen from him appears to be a realization that the company is headed down essentially a toxic road, and a genuine intent to try and turn that around. Some of the internal documents that have been either leaked or supplied to the press saying we're not going to do this anymore, this is the way we want to build, that seems like a promising arc that they're on. I think the world needs an ethical Uber, whether it's Uber or whether it's a different company, but that service is clearly very popular. So they may be heading towards the territory where I can point at a company that's turning it around. My concern is I can't point at a single company that's doing all of these things right. As I say, they're just doing it. There's one really strong on privacy. There's one that's good on the politics, or one that's trying to do the right thing for sustainability. But none as yet in the tech industry that are hitting all of those at the same time.
Sure. I mean, I guess it's a big old kind of problem, and it's something that's definitely it's going to be emerging and evolving. So I guess it's probably a hard ask just for somebody to get full marks on something which is sort of still not completely known and understood.
Absolutely, it's still emergent, and of course, companies still have commercial imperatives, and those two will be in conflict sometimes. And I'm not so naive to assume that the ethical choice will always win out over the profitable choice. And
so, if I was to say to you that, it's early days in this, but if you've got a leader, an executive, or an entrepreneur, and they're listening to this, or they're reading the highlights, and they're going, yeah, that's kind of that's in my back garden as well. I mean, what advice would you give them, and where should they start? I mean, is it all about having the right set of values, making their assumptions kind of clear, and then forcing them to go through to build an even more robust kind of governance and QA structure, or is that where they kind of start, or is it simpler than that?
I think there are probably three things I'd recommend there. The first is, the culture is so important.
Right.
And I come back to the VW scandal here, actually. And, obviously there were these inquests, these investigations into what happened with this scandal. And the VW Group chief exec, I think, was a guy called Martin Winkelhorn. Mm-hmm. And he told the investigators, well, he didn't see how he could possibly be implicated in this. This was all way below his level. He didn't know what was going on. I think that's dead wrong, because he clearly created a culture, as did Travis Kalanick at Uber, created a culture that rewarded unethical behavior, that rewarded people for making these tweaks to evade detection and so on. So it's absolutely a cultural responsibility. So I think values, core values projects are sometimes sneered at, but when they're done right, and I've been at companies that have done them right, they're really powerful ethical drivers. So if you have an executive listening to this podcast and thinks, well, people aren't really taking our core values seriously, well, reinvest in them, figure out why that is, what can you do to make them more current and relevant. Mm-hmm. Related to that, I think my second point is you need to start talking about ethics as an ongoing and complex issue, particularly in the tech industry, because we're dealing with things we haven't really come across before a lot of the time. I think too often I see in large companies, particularly, ethics is like an annual compliance thing, right? It's financial, it's driven by SOX compliance or something like that. You might send out a little training video and you tick the box to say, great, I'm now ethically compliant for the year. That doesn't work. That doesn't solve some of these tricky ongoing problems we have. So I would urge leadership teams to be open about the decisions and the trade-offs and the compromises that they have to make. And say, we thought we've got this problem ahead of us. We've considered X, Y, and Z. We want to pursue this particular route. But then, thirdly, you need to encourage employee involvement in that. You need to manage that carefully, of course. You don't want it to drag you down too much. But maybe there are situations where you may want to set up an ethics panel or have a couple of people whose job it is just to push on some of these issues a little bit more. So I'm very keen to avoid this idea that ethics should hamper innovation. I think done right, it can actually spark innovation. You can use it as a driver to say, well, if we want to do something that really benefits our users and broader societies or groups that we want to, whose needs we want to foster, what does that look like for us in terms of the product?
Sure.
And the decisions that we make. So it's about reframing it that it's something you want employee input on and that can actually drive you on to entirely new ideas that you may not have otherwise stumbled across.
I think that's a really interesting point, because actually this idea of thinking about ethics as almost applying restraint or constraints, and how if you kind of as you say, reframe something, you force people to solve a problem that you've not, in a way that you've not actually looked at it before. And it brings to power, I guess, that again, that old kind of like piece of wisdom which says necessity is the mother of all invention. And so if you kind of restrain or constrain it based on your values, your culture, kind of your ethical stance, then it will force your people to be more innovative and more creative in that sort of kind of redrawn sort of frame, as it were.
Yeah, I think you're right. Designers love constraints. Constraints may sound like they hamper design, but no, they don't. They foster design. The most terrifying thing you can do to a designer, for instance, is say, you need to design a product. There are no limits.
Here's a blank sheet of paper.
Right. It doesn't work. What are the materials? What's the budget? What's the user base? What's the intended purpose? And so on. And you just apply that as another constraint, and you'll be surprised that it doesn't. Sure, it'll narrow down some options, but it will open up a whole new set of options that you probably wouldn't have considered on that drawing board. So you're right. Yeah, it is about framing that as a positive generating potential there rather than a limitation.
Perfect. So, kind of before I ask you my final question, I mean, is there anything on this in this sort of debate, discussion, think piece that we've missed out that you'd like to highlight before I ask you my final question?
Well, let's see. One thing that maybe comes to mind is the necessity of diversity within this. Now, this has become a bit of a politicized concept, I think, but I see diversity as terrifically important for ethics because it acts as an early warning system within your company. If you have a diverse team, that team is very likely to be more attuned to the potential dangers of things you're about to ship for their own communities or people with backgrounds that they may have encountered in their past and present. And I can think of quite a few examples where I've been in, Silicon Valley or, tech company meeting rooms, and it's been often, a minority employee that stuck their hand up and say, hey, by the way, just so you know, this actually is potentially quite problematic for folks from, a particular community or, it's a community I'm involved in. And maybe we shouldn't do it that way. Maybe we need to consult them and reframe it. And a lot of time people are going, wow, I didn't even know. I had no idea that our technology will be used in a different way or would potentially harm, whoever it may be. So investing in diversity has all sorts of other benefits, but I think it has an ethical benefit as well. So it's something I think is worth considering very much as part of this solution.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think the thing is, I think you're absolutely right. The idea about diversity has become quite highly politicized, and I think it's, for many people, it also feels a bit like a bit of a tick box sort of thing. But I mean, I would just like to kind of say that for me, when I think about diversity, it's across the piece, and it's a multidimensional thing, whether it's age or gender or nationality or sexual orientation or religion or kind of even physical kind of ability and so on and so forth. And so it is one of those things that you need to look at it kind of closely, because it's not as simple as it might as it might sound, and also kind of how it's often talked about, in the media.
Yeah, it's I do think that people who approach it and think that this is a quota filling, box ticking exercise will get nothing from it, because they don't care. They're not in it to really reap the benefits of diversity. They're doing it because they feel that they have to, and that's a mistaken and dangerous approach, I would say.
Perfect. So that brings me to my last question. I always ask at the end of these podcasts, and I've done nearly 250 of them now, which
wow, okay,
which is kind of like ridiculous, but brilliant as well. And the question is this: is there anything that you would like to shamelessly plug?
Well, I mean, the book Future Ethics will be out. I think it's going to be the summer now. Keep an eye out for that. I have a site up at future-ethics.com. And I've also just released a newsletter, and I just sent out the first issue of that. It's going to be short and curious thoughts on emerging technology and ethics and culture. And you can find that's at tinyletter.com/Cennydd. That's CENNYDD.
Perfect. I will make sure I get that all kind of linked up and give the book and the newsletter a big shout out. But I just wanted to say congratulations on your work. I think it's an essential topic and a big load to bring into the center of the the discussion that's going on right now. It's much needed. But I just want to say thank you for your time and sharing your insight and expertise, and it's been a pleasure to talk to you today. So thanks very much.
That's my pleasure. Thank you, Adrian. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you for the opportunity.